They say that the deepest wounds are inflicted not by our enemies, but by those we trust the most. An enemy's strike is expected. You build walls, you stay vigilant, and you understand the rules of engagement, but a betrayal from within your own family? That's a different kind of warfare. It's a quiet poison, administered with a smile over a dinner table, a knife slid between your ribs during a warm embrace. You say things that Marta do not think. I do not bow. It dismantles your understanding of the world, making you question the very foundation of your life. For me, that foundation was supposed to be unshakable, built on the love of my grandfather and the home he had created. But I learned, in the harshest way imaginable, that some people see a foundation not as something to build upon, but as something to sell for parts. They say that the deepest wounds are inflicted not by our enemies, but by those we trust the most. An enemy's strike is expected. You build walls, you stay vigilant, and you understand the rules of engagement. But a betrayal from within your own family? That's a different kind of warfare. It's a quiet poison, administered with a smile over a dinner table, a knife slid between your ribs during a warm embrace. It dismantles your understanding of the world, making you question the very foundation of your life. For me, that foundation was supposed to be unshakable, built on the love of my grandfather and the home he had created. But I learned, in the harshest way imaginable, that some people see a foundation not as something to build upon, but as something to sell for parts. While I was halfway across the world, serving my country in a place where the air was thick with sand and uncertainty, my own parents saw my sacrifice not as a point of pride, but as a window of opportunity. To them, my deployment wasn't a selfless act, it was a convenient absence. It was a problem. Me, the sentimental daughter, the keeper of a legacy they didn't value, conveniently removed from the equation. While I was counting the days until I could return to the safety and comfort of the only true home I had ever known, they were counting the dollars they could get for it. They saw my grandfather's house not as a home filled with memories, but as a dormant bank account they were finally free to liquidate. When people ask me to explain what happened, I've learned over the years to dispense with the complicated, messy emotions and the long-winded explanations of their motivations. The excuses they offered were just noise, a smokescreen of manufactured justifications designed to obscure a very simple and ugly truth. So now, I state it plainly, because the truth deserves to be unvarnished. They sold my inheritance, my childhood home, and my future, all for the price of a used luxury car and a fleeting vacation. They packaged up my entire history, the scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains, the pencil marks on the door frame marking my height through the years, and sold it to the highest bidder. They believed their plan was foolproof. I was thousands of miles away, occupied with matters of life and death, disconnected from the mundane transactions of civilian life. They were confident that by the time I returned, the deed would be done, the money spent, and I would be left with no choice but to accept their version of reality. They imagined I would be too heartbroken, too exhausted from my service, to fight back. They thought I was too far away to stop them. In this, and in so many other things, they were profoundly wrong. They had underestimated not only me, but the enduring wisdom of the man who had raised me, a man who had always known their true nature, and had taken one final brilliant step to protect me from it, even after he was gone. That wisdom my grandfather possessed wasn't the loud academic kind. It was a quiet, observant intelligence, honed over a lifetime of working with his hands and reading people's character. He was a carpenter by trade, and he saw the world in much the same way he saw a piece of timber. He could spot the hidden knots, the weak points, the unseen rot beneath a polished surface. He certainly saw it in my parents. He loved his daughter, my mother, but he was never blind to her character or to the man she had married, and because he saw them so clearly, he invested his time, his love, and his legacy in me. From a very young age, I was his shadow. While other kids were playing with dolls, I was in his workshop, learning the difference between oak and pine, the smell of sawdust and wood varnish becoming the scent of my childhood. He taught me how to be self-sufficient, how to mend what was broken, and how to build things that were meant to last. He was, in every meaningful way, my parent. My actual parents were more like distant relatives who happened to live in the same town. They were caught up in their own world, a world that revolved around appearances, social circles, and the perpetual, anxious pursuit of more. More money, a newer car, a bigger television. Their lives were a treadmill of wanting, and they were always slightly out of breath. My grandfather's world was the opposite. It was about having enough. Enough food on the table, enough love in the home, enough integrity in your heart. The house he lived in, the one he built with his own 2 hands after he returned from his own service decades ago, was the physical embodiment of that philosophy. It wasn't grand or modern, but it was solid. It had integrity. It was a sanctuary, and he made sure I knew that it was my sanctuary too. I remember the day he officially gave it to me. I was 25, just a few months away from my first enlistment. We were sitting on the front porch swing he'd built, the chains groaning a familiar rhythm. He handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside were the documents, the deed, the title, all freshly signed over to my name. He didn't make a big speech. He just looked at me, his eyes clear and direct, and said, "A person needs a place to come home to, not just a building, but a true north, a place that doesn't change, no matter how much the world or the people in it do. This is your true north now." For me, it was never about the monetary value. It was about that promise, a place of unconditional belonging. I was by nature a dutiful and trusting person, and I accepted this gift with the solemnity it deserved. My parents, on the other hand, never understood this. To them, the house wasn't a sanctuary, it was an asset. A poorly managed, underperforming asset. Whenever they visited, they seemed to see only flaws. "The property taxes on this land must be a killer," my father would muse, looking out at the yard. "You know, the Henderson property, 2 blocks over, sold for a fortune. They put up a duplex," my mother would add, her tone implying that my grandfather, and by extension me, were foolish for letting such potential go to waste. They saw my love for the house as a childish sentimentality. They saw the upkeep I did on weekends not as an act of love, but as a waste of time and money that could be better spent elsewhere. Their jealousy of my bond with my grandfather was a quiet, simmering thing that had been cooking for years. They'd make passive-aggressive comments, calling me Grandpa's little heiress with a tight smile. They resented that he had given the house, his most valuable possession, to me, his granddaughter, instead of to his only child, my mother. They couldn't comprehend that he hadn't given me a thing. He had given me a responsibility, a legacy he trusted me to protect because he knew they would not. In their minds, they had been cheated out of something they were owed, and so the house became a symbol of their perceived victimhood. The burden, as they so often called it, wasn't the maintenance or the taxes. The burden was that it was mine and not theirs. Before I deployed, this dynamic was our normal, an uneasy truce held together by my determined effort to see the good in them, to believe that deep down they were better than their worst impulses. I was wrong. I trusted them with information, with access to my affairs for emergencies, never once believing they would view the greatest challenge of my life as the perfect crime of opportunity. That uneasy truce, that fragile belief in their better nature, was shattered on a Tuesday. I remember the day with a strange clarity, the way you remember the exact details of a car crash. The air on the base was thick with dust, and the sun was a relentless white-hot disk in the sky. Connection to the outside world was a lifeline, and a stable video call was a rare luxury. So when a call came through from Mark, my childhood neighbor, a man I hadn't spoken to in years, I answered it immediately, a brief smile on my face, assuming he was just reaching out to say hello. His face appeared on my screen, pixelated and worried. He looked older than I remembered, his brow furrowed with a confusion that set my teeth on edge. He skipped the pleasantries. "Hey," he started, his voice tinny and distant. "Sorry to bother you over there, but I've got to ask, are you selling the house?" The question didn't compute. It was like he'd asked me if the sky was green. I laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Selling? No, of course not, Mark. Why would you think that?" His face didn't relax. "Well," he said, and then he flipped his camera around. The image was shaky, but it was unmistakable. There was my front porch, the swing my grandfather and I had planted. There were the rose bushes my grandmother had planted, a little overgrown, but still there, and staked right in the middle of the lawn, a bold, garish slash of red and white against the familiar green, was a large sign. I could make out one word clearly, even through the poor connection. Sold. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My blood ran cold, a glacial freeze that started in my chest and spread through my limbs. It had to be a mistake, a prank, a misunderstanding. "Mark," I said, my voice tight and thin, "can you get a little closer to that sign?" He did, and my stomach plummeted. It was a professional real estate sign with a smaller banner slapped across the middle. Sold. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Had the bank made an error? Was there some kind of property tax issue I didn't know about? There were 100 possibilities, and not one of them involved the two people whose names were now screaming in my head. I thanked Mark, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears, and ended the call. My hands were shaking. I immediately dialed my parents. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice infuriatingly cheerful. "Hi, sweetie, what a surprise to hear from you." I cut right through it. "Mom, why is there a sold sign on my lawn?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It stretched for 3, 4, 5 seconds, and in that silence, I had my answer. The lie, when it came, was clumsy and weak. "A sign? Oh, honey, that must be a mistake. Probably the neighbors. You know how those real estate agents are, always mixing up addresses." She was a terrible liar. I could hear the tremor in her voice. "Mark sent me a video, Mom. The sign is in my yard, in front of my house. I need you to tell me what's going on, right now." That's when my father got on the phone. His tone wasn't cheerful. It was defensive, belligerent. "What's all the fuss about?" he demanded. The story then came tumbling out, a disgusting avalanche of excuses and justifications. "It was an emergency," he said. "The roof needed replacing. The furnace was about to go. The upkeep was just becoming too much for us to handle. For you," my mother chimed in, as if they were doing me a favor. "We were going to tell you, sweetie. We were just waiting for the right time." The right time, as if there was a right time to tell your child you've ripped their entire world out from under them. The final, devastating blow came when I asked them how. How could they possibly sell a house that wasn't theirs? My father's voice dropped, becoming heavy with a false sense of authority. "We used the power of attorney you gave us." I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. The power of attorney. The document I had signed in a sterile legal office just before I left, my hands trembling slightly as I imagined the worst-case scenarios. It was a document that gave them the power to make medical decisions for me if I was incapacitated. It was a sacred trust, a testament to my faith in them to protect my life. And they had taken that trust, that document meant to save me in a moment of ultimate vulnerability, and twisted it into a tool for financial gain. They had weaponized my love and trust against me. The deceit was so calculated, so profoundly cruel, that it left me speechless. The conversation ended with their empty platitudes echoing in my ear. "We did it for the family. You'll understand one day." But all I heard was the sound of my heart breaking. They hadn't just sold a house. They had sold me. After that first call, I sat on the edge of my cot for a long time, the satellite phone feeling unnaturally heavy in my hand. The sounds of the bass, the distant hum of a generator, the shout of orders across the compound, faded into a dull, meaningless roar. The shock wasn't a loud, explosive thing. It was a quiet, suffocating pressure, a weight settling deep in my bones. My first instinct was denial, a desperate search for a crack in their story, a loophole that would make it all a terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps they were confused. Perhaps they had been scammed themselves. My mind, trained to assess threats and find solutions, was scrambling for a logical path. But the cold, hard tone in my father's voice had left no room for doubt. This was no mistake. It was a strategy. I gave myself 10 minutes. 10 minutes to let the initial wave of grief and betrayal wash over me, to feel the sting in my eyes and the knot tightening in my stomach. Then I pushed it all down. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. I needed clarity. I needed information. I called them back. This time there was no pretense of cheerfulness. My father answered, his voice already laced with irritation, as if I were the one inconveniencing him. I kept my own voice level, devoid of the storm that was raging inside me. "I want to know who you sold it to," I said. "I want the name of the buyer and the real estate agency. I'm going to try and fix this." A humorless laugh crackled through the phone. "Fix this?" my father scoffed. "There's nothing to fix. The deal is done. The papers are signed. It's over." His belligerence was a wall, designed to shut down any attempt at reason. "You're a soldier," he said, and the way he spat the word made it sound like an accusation rather than a fact. "You're never even here. You're off playing hero in the desert, while real life goes on back home. We have needs, you know. We're not getting any younger. Were we just supposed to let that house sit there, rotting while we struggled?" The word struggled was absurd. They weren't struggling, they were comfortable. What they meant was that they weren't rich. They didn't have the carefree, luxurious lifestyle they saw on television and felt they were owed. That's when my mother joined in, her voice a sickly sweet syrup of faux reason. "Your father is right, honey. We had to think of the family's future." She then delivered the next calculated blow, the one designed to make the situation feel irreversible. "Besides, the money is already in use. We put a significant down payment on a lovely condo. It's in a gated community right by the water. It's secure, it's an investment for all of us." The sheer audacity was stunning. She was painting a picture of our happy family future funded by the demolition of my past. She wanted me to see their betrayal as a practical, even thoughtful business decision. But the worst was yet to come. I pressed them for the buyer's identity, and my father finally relented, his tone dripping with dismissive contempt. "It doesn't matter who bought it," he said. "It's some big property developer. They're not interested in the house. They're going to tear it down and build a bunch of cheap townhouses. It's what they do." Hearing those words felt like a physical impact. It wasn't just that they had sold my home, they had sold it to be executed. They had handed it over to someone who would not just occupy it, but erase it from existence. Every memory, every pencil mark on the doorframe, every floorboard my grandfather had laid by hand, all of it would be reduced to a pile of splintered wood and dust, simply for profit. I was silent, trying to process this new layer of violation. My silence seemed to irritate my mother. "Oh, don't be so sentimental," she snapped, her sweet facade finally cracking to reveal the hard, cold resentment beneath. "Honestly, it was just an old drafty house. It's just wood and nails. You need to grow up and understand how the real world works." Grow up. The two words hung in the air between us, an insult of such profound ignorance that it momentarily cleared the fog of my grief and replaced it with a sharp, cold clarity. I was the one living in the real world, a world of genuine sacrifice, of life and death. They were the children, living in a fantasy where their selfish wants trumped loyalty, honor, and love. They hadn't just crossed a line, they had torched the entire In that moment, something inside me shifted. The heartbroken daughter receded, and the soldier took her place. A soldier who now had a new mission. My objective was no longer to fix what they had broken, it was to seek justice. In the days that followed that phone call, a strange and hollow calm settled over me. The initial, fiery rage had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, hard ash of reality. I went through the motions of my duties on the base, my body operating on autopilot while my mind replayed their words, over and over. "You're never even here. It's just wood and nails. Grow up." Each phrase was a small, sharp stone I turned over and over in my thoughts, examining its cruel edges. The emotional connection I had once fought so hard to maintain with my parents felt like a frayed rope that had finally snapped. I wasn't just their daughter anymore. I was a problem they had solved, an obstacle they had removed. And the most painful part was the realization that this wasn't a sudden break in their character. This was who they had always been. I had just refused to see it. My grandfather had seen it, and now, with the blinders of filial duty finally ripped away, so did I. The breaking point, the final irrevocable severing, didn't come with a shout or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived silently, disguised as a notification on my laptop during a rare moment of downtime. An email from my mother. The subject line was simply, "Thinking of you." For a split second, a foolish, desperate part of me hoped it might be an apology, a retraction, a confession of a terrible mistake. That hope was extinguished before I even finished reading the first paragraph. The email was a masterpiece of manipulation, a carefully constructed document of self-serving lies and condescending pity. It began with a tone of saccharine concern, telling me how worried she was after our emotional phone call, and how she hoped I was thinking more clearly now. She wrote about the condo they had purchased, describing the sea breeze and the beautiful view, as if she were writing a travel postcard. She was trying to sell me on the wonderful new life they had built for themselves upon the ruins of mine. Then came the core of the message, the part that was intended to placate me, to buy my silence. "Your father and I were talking," she wrote, "and we know this has been a difficult adjustment for you, so we wanted to give you a little something to help you get on your feet when you come back. We've deposited a small share of the proceeds from the house sale into your account. Please think of it as a gift from us to help you start your new future." A gift. They had stolen my entire inheritance, a home worth a small fortune, and in return they were offering me a pittance, a few $1,000s of my own money, and calling it a gift? It was like a thief stealing your car and then mailing you bus fare. The insult was so profound, so utterly tone-deaf, that I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my chest. I kept reading, and the condescension only deepened. "You're still young," she continued, "and you don't understand the complexities of finance and real estate. This was the most responsible decision for the family as a whole." But it was the final sentence, the one she probably thought was her masterstroke of emotional manipulation, that truly sealed their fate. It was the line that turned my cold anger into something harder, something sharper, something that felt like steel crystallizing in my veins. "Try to understand," she concluded. "Your grandfather was a practical man. He would have wanted us to be secure and happy." That was it. That was the moment the war began. To invoke his name, to twist his memory into a shield for their boundless greed, was a desecration. My grandfather, the man who taught me the meaning of integrity, the man who saw their materialism for the poison it was, would have been horrified. He didn't build that house with his bare hands so they could trade it for a waterfront view and a fleeting sense of status. He built it as a legacy, a testament to the value of things that money cannot buy. In that moment, sitting in a sterile, temporary room, thousands of miles from a home that no longer existed, I felt his presence more strongly than ever. I knew he wouldn't have just gotten angry. He would have gotten to work. He would have assessed the damage, opened his toolbox, and methodically, intelligently, he would have started building a solution. My grief was now gone, burned away by a white-hot resolve. They had invoked his memory to justify their crime. I would invoke his wisdom to deliver their punishment. The time for being a victim was over. It was time to find my tools. The mission began in the sterile quiet of my small room, the only light coming from the glow of my laptop screen. My tools, in this modern age, weren't hammers and saws, but passwords and encrypted files. After reading my mother's email, the fire of raw emotion had cooled into a focused, diamond-hard resolve. They wanted to talk about practicality and the complexities of the real world? Fine. I would give them a lesson in due diligence they would never forget. My first objective was to gather intelligence. I logged into the secure digital vault I'd set up years ago, a cloud-based repository for every important document in my life: my birth certificate, my military records, my financial statements, and, most importantly, every single piece of paper related to my grandfather's estate. I was operating on a sliver of hope, a belief that my parents, in their haste and arrogance, might have made a mistake. A missed signature, a procedural error, some tiny legal thread I could pull on to unravel the entire fraudulent sale. My fingers flew across the trackpad, my eyes scanning document after document. There it was, the house title, transferred to my name just as my grandfather had promised, and there, tucked in the same folder, was a scanned copy of the power of attorney I had so foolishly signed. I read through the legal jargon, my stomach twisting as I saw how they had twisted its purpose. Everything on the surface appeared to be in order. The documents they had used were legitimate. My heart sank. For a moment, I allowed a wave of despair to wash over me. Maybe they were right. Maybe the deal was done and there was nothing I could do. But my grandfather's voice echoed in my mind, a memory from my teenage years when I was struggling with a complex project in his workshop. "Don't just look at the problem," he had said, tapping his temple. "Look around it. The solution is often in the place you're not looking." So I took a deep breath and looked around. I scanned the list of files in the property folder again. House title, insurance policy, property tax records. And then, one more, a file I had almost overlooked, titled simply, Land Deed, D Street. I had assumed it was just an older copy of the house title. But something, some instinct I couldn't explain, made me click on it. The document materialized on the screen. a scanned copy of an old, thick piece of paper filled with the dense looping script of official legal records, and as I read the names and the dates, the world around me went silent. My breath caught in my chest. The memory didn't just come back. It hit me like a physical force, a lightning bolt that lit up the past with perfect, searing clarity. I was 18 years old again, sitting at the heavy oak dining table in my grandfather's house. The air smelled of lemon polish and old books. He was there, looking more serious than I had ever seen him, and with him was his old friend, a semi-retired lawyer named Mr. Henderson. There was a stack of papers in front of me, and my grandfather pushed one towards me. "I need you to sign this," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is the deed to the land this house sits on. Not the house, mind you, the ground itself, the foundation." I remember being confused. "But I thought you were leaving me the house in your will," I had asked. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "I am," he'd said. "But a will can be read by anyone. It can be contested. It becomes part of a public conversation after I'm gone. This is a private one, between you and me. A house is just a box of wood and memories, and it can be taken away. But the land is forever. A person needs to own the ground they stand on." I signed it, not fully understanding the weight of the moment, trusting him as I always had. We had the document notarized, and he had it filed with the county, a quiet, unannounced transaction. Now, staring at that same signature on my laptop screen, I understood everything. His incredible, heartbreaking foresight. He knew my parents. He knew their greed and their resentment. He had set up a brilliant, two-layered defense for his legacy. He had willed me the house, the physical structure. In his will, the public document my parents had found and used. But he had deeded me the land, the very soil the house was built on, separately, privately, years before the will was even a factor. A hysterical, relieved laugh escaped my lips. My parents, in their greedy, frantic rush to cash in, had only done a surface-level search. They had found the will, found the documents for the house itself, and assumed that was everything. They had sold the building, but they never had the legal right to the ground it was standing on. They had sold a hat, but they didn't own the head it was sitting on. The developer hadn't bought a valuable piece of real estate. They had bought a building they couldn't access, sitting on land they didn't own, from sellers who had committed fraud. It wasn't a small procedural error I had found, it was a legal bomb, and I was holding the detonator. The despair vanished, replaced by an electrifying icy calm. I finally had my weapon. It was heavier, more powerful, and more elegant than I could have ever imagined, and I knew, with absolute certainty, how I was going to use it. The discovery of that land deed was not a moment of explosive, fist-pumping victory. It was something far deeper and more powerful. It was a moment of profound, quiet alignment, as if a key had finally turned in a lock I didn't even know existed. The chaos and grief in my mind receded, replaced by a singular, unwavering focus. I was no longer a victim reacting to a betrayal. I was a commander with a clear objective and a superior weapon. The battlefield had been chosen, and the rules of engagement were now mine to write. My first move, made within the hour, was to find a lawyer. Thanks to the military's legal assistance programs, I was on a secure video call with a sharp, no-nonsense civilian attorney from my home state before the sun had even risen there. I explained the situation calmly and methodically, my voice betraying none of the turmoil of the past few days. I watched his face on the screen as I emailed him the scanned documents, the will, the power of attorney my parents had used, and finally the land deed from when I was 18. He was silent for a long time as he read, his expression shifting from professional sympathy to focused intrigue, and finally to a slow, widening grin. "Ma'am," he said, and the respect in his voice was palpable, "your grandfather was a very, very smart man. This is what we in the business call ironclad. Your parents have sold a physical structure, but they had absolutely no legal right to sell the land it occupies. They've committed fraud. The buyer, this development company, has purchased a building they cannot legally access, insure, or connect to utilities without your express permission, which I assume you have no intention of giving." He was right. A surge of validation, cold and clean, washed over me. "What's our first step?" I asked. "We don't go after your parents first," he advised, a predatory gleam in his eye. "We go after the developer. We cut the head off the snake." Within 24 hours, my lawyer had served the developer with a formal cease and desist letter and a notice of trespassing, legally barring them and any of their contractors from setting foot on my land. The reaction was immediate and exactly as we had predicted. The developer, a major corporation with millions of dollars on the line, did not take kindly to the news that they had been duped into buying a completely worthless asset. Their own legal team, a pack of corporate sharks, immediately pivoted and filed a massive lawsuit against the sellers, my parents, for fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of contract, demanding a full refund plus damages. The first domino had fallen, triggering a chain reaction of financial devastation that I didn't even have to manage directly. My parents were now fighting a war on a second front they never saw coming. With the legal machinery in motion, it was time to go home. I put in for emergency leave, citing a critical family legal matter. The irony was not lost on me. The flight back to the States was surreal. On the way out, the plane had been filled with the nervous energy of departure. On the way back, I was a solitary instrument of justice, flying towards a confrontation of my own making. I didn't feel anger or sadness anymore. I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. I was the executor of my grandfather's final, unspoken will. I landed and got to work. I did not call my parents. I did not drive by the house. My first 2 phone calls were clinical and precise. The first was to the largest demolition company in the county. I explained the situation briefly, that I owned the land and needed the unauthorized structure on it removed. I scheduled an excavator and a full crew for a week's time, paying the deposit with a clear and steady hand. The second call was to a local process server. I had my lawyer draft a legally binding notice, an official-looking document filled with intimidating jargon. It summoned my parents to the property on the day of the demolition for what was described as a mandatory property survey and boundary assessment related to the ongoing legal dispute. It was a formal, inescapable summons. They could ignore a call from their daughter, but they couldn't ignore a legal notice. They were being summoned to a meeting, but what they didn't know was that they were the only ones who didn't know the agenda. The stage was set, the trap was baited. All I had to do now was wait for the curtain to rise. The day of the survey dawned clear and cool, one of those perfect autumn mornings where the air feels crisp and clean. I arrived at the property early, well before anyone else. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, the same spot where I used to wait for the school bus, and just looked. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and infinitely sadder. It was a hostage, a silent victim in a crime it had no part in. A few minutes later, the demolition crew arrived. The low rumble of their heavy trucks was a jarring intrusion into the quiet neighborhood. The centerpiece was a massive yellow excavator, its long arm and metal claw looking like a prehistoric predator. The crew, professional and efficient, moved about their work, setting up safety cones and perimeter tape. They paid me little mind, just a respectful nod. To them, it was just another job site. To me, it was a courtroom, and court was about to be in session. Right on time, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. My parents emerged, dressed as if for a business meeting. My father wore a blazer, his expression a mask of bored impatience. My mother wore a stylish coat, a pair of oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes, a look of distinct annoyance on her face. They were flanked by a man in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He radiated an aura of smug confidence. This was their lawyer, a man hired to swat away a minor legal nuisance. They saw me standing with my own lawyer near the edge of the lawn and strode towards us, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. They completely ignored me, directing all their attention to the attorneys, as if this were a matter between professionals and I was merely a child who had thrown a tantrum. "All right," their lawyer began, forgoing any introduction and glancing ostentatiously at his watch. "Let's get this little survey over with. My clients are very busy people. Just point out the boundary line in question so we can all get on with our day." He was trying to take command, to frame the situation as a trivial dispute that my legal counsel had foolishly escalated. My lawyer didn't respond. He simply held out a single folded document. "Before we discuss any boundaries," he said, his voice calm and even, "I believe you need to see this." My father's lawyer took the paper with a huff of theatrical exasperation. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the top lines with a dismissive air. Then he stopped. It was a subtle shift, but from where I stood, it was as clear as a seismic event. The condescending smirk on his face faltered, his posture straightened. His eyes, which had been glancing around impatiently, were now locked on the page. He read it once. Then he read it again, his lips moving silently. The color drained from his face. The noisy, self-important man from 30 seconds ago had vanished, replaced by a silent, stunned professional who understood, with sickening clarity, the catastrophic document he was holding. "This can't be right," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. He looked up at my lawyer, his professional mask crumbling. "This is a recorded land deed, filed and notarized." "That's correct," my lawyer said quietly. My parents, who had been standing back with an air of superiority, began to grow restless. "What is it?" my father demanded, stepping forward. "What's the problem?" Their lawyer didn't seem to hear him. He was still staring at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. He looked from the deed to the house, then to the giant excavator parked ominously beside it, and a wave of dawning horror washed over his features as all the pieces clicked into place. He turned to my parents, pulling them aside with an urgent gesture. He began speaking to them in a low, frantic whisper. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I didn't need to. I could read the story on my parents' faces. I watched my father's expression morph from arrogance to confusion, then to sputtering disbelief. He snatched the paper from his lawyer's hand, his own eyes scanning it frantically. I saw the moment he understood. The arrogant set of his shoulders collapsed. His mouth fell open, a silent O of utter devastation. My mother's reaction was far more theatrical. As the lawyer explained the situation to her, she ripped off her sunglasses, her eyes wide with shock, then narrowing with rage. "What are you talking about?" I heard her shriek, her voice cracking. "That's impossible. The will gave us the house." Her lawyer shook his head, pointing to a line on the deed. "The will gave you the structure, Margaret," he said, his voice strained. "It never mentioned the land. The land has belonged to your daughter since she was 18 years old." And there it was, the truth, laid bare on a crisp autumn morning. They were standing on my property. They had fraudulently sold a building that was, for all intents and purposes, a glorified mobile home they had no right to keep on my land. All their plans, their condo, their new life, had been built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was now coming in with ferocious speed. My mother turned to me then, her face a grotesque mask of fury and panic. "You did this," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger. "You planned this. This is our money. You are ruining us." My father found his voice, a weak and reedy version of his usual bluster. "We're your parents. How could you do this to your own family?" They pleaded, they threatened, they raged. They cycled through every stage of grief and denial right there on the lawn. They spoke of being financially ruined, of how the developer would sue them into oblivion, of how they would lose everything. And through it all, I didn't say a single word. I just stood there, calm and silent, and let them hear the echo of their own choices. Their downfall wasn't happening because of what I was doing. It was happening because of what they had already done. My silence was the most powerful response I could have given because it offered them no argument to fight, no emotion to manipulate. There was only the cold, hard reality of the consequences they now faced, standing beside the very thing they had stolen, about to watch it be erased. Their rage and panic eventually subsided, sputtering out like a dying fire and leaving behind the cold, wet ash of pure desperation. The threats gave way to pathetic, disjointed pleading. My mother, her face streaked with tears that had ruined her carefully applied makeup, took a step towards me, her hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication that was utterly alien to her. "Please, honey," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Don't do this. Think of all the good memories. Your first steps were in that living room. Your grandfather taught you to read on that porch. You can't just erase it all." It was a last-ditch attempt at manipulation, a clumsy appeal to the sentimental daughter she believed still existed. But she didn't understand. She was using the memories as currency, just as she had used the house itself. To her, they were tools to get what she wanted. To me, they were sacred, and it was precisely because I cherished those memories that I had to do this. The house, as it stood, was no longer a monument to my grandfather's love. It was a monument to their greed. It had been tainted, profaned by their actions. The only way to cleanse it, to honor the real memories, was to wipe the slate clean. My father, seeing that her pleading was having no effect, tried a different tactic. He attempted to muster some semblance of his old authority, puffing up his chest. "There will be consequences for this," he said, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound firm. "You think you can just destroy property? We will sue you for everything you have." His own lawyer flinched, giving him a sharp, warning look. But my father was beyond reason. He was a cornered animal, lashing out with threats that had no teeth. He was threatening to sue me for destroying a building that was trespassing on my own land. The absurdity of it all was tragic. I looked from his contorted face to my mother's weeping one, and I felt nothing. Not hatred, not pity, not even the bitter satisfaction I had expected. All I felt was a profound and sorrowful finality. This was the end of a long and painful road, the closing of a door that should have been locked long ago. They were strangers to me now, two people who wore the faces of my parents, but had none of the love or loyalty that word implied. They were seeing the house, the demolition crew, the excavator. They weren't seeing the decades of selfishness, the casual disregard, the slow-motion betrayal that had led us all to this exact moment. My lawyer glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you ready?" I gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then I turned my head and looked past my parents' desperate, pleading faces. My gaze found the foreman of the demolition crew, who was standing by his truck, patiently waiting. He was a big man with a weathered face, and he had watched the entire drama unfold with a neutral, professional calm. I met his eyes. I didn't need to speak. I just gave a simple, sharp nod. It was a simple gesture, but it was a verdict. It was the gavel falling. The foreman raised a hand and gave a signal to the operator in the excavator's cab. The machine, which had been sitting silent, roared to life. The deep, guttural rumble of the diesel engine shattered the morning's quiet, a sound of absolute, mechanical finality. My mother flinched, as if she'd been struck, letting out a small, strangled gasp. My father stood frozen, his mouth agape. The excavator's long arm rose slowly, majestically into the air. The giant metal claw at its end opened and closed once, like a dragon testing its jaws. Then, with a hydraulic hiss, the arm swung towards the house. It aimed for the front porch, the very place my grandfather had sat when he told me this would always be my true north. For a fraction of a second, everything hung in suspension. The claw poised in the air, my mother's hand covering her mouth, my father's wide, unbelieving eyes. Then the claw came down. The sound was a violent, deafening explosion of splintering timber and shattering glass. The porch roof, where we had sheltered from summer rains, collapsed in an instant. The white support columns my grandfather had so carefully painted snapped like toothpicks. The swing he and I had built was crushed, obliterated under the force of the impact. It was an act of shocking, irreversible violence. My mother let out a piercing shriek, a sound of pure, animalistic agony. It wasn't a sound of grief for lost memories. It was the sound of a winning lottery ticket being torn up before her eyes. My father physically stumbled backward, his hand flying to his chest as if he'd suffered a blow himself. They were watching their payday, their waterfront condo, their secure future, being turned into a pile of worthless rubble. The excavator pulled back and swung again, this time smashing through the large picture window of the living room. The wall buckled and caved in, revealing the interior like a gruesome cross-section of a dollhouse. Another swing, and a whole section of the roof came crashing down in a cloud of dust and insulation. The destruction was methodical, efficient, and utterly complete. I stood and watched, my face impassive, as the home of my childhood was systematically unmade. Each crashing wall, each shattering window was an echo of their lies being torn apart. This wasn't revenge. This was an exorcism. It was the painful but necessary act of demolishing a monument to their greed, so that something new, something built on an honest foundation, could one day grow in its place. I didn't stay to watch the whole thing. Once the initial, catastrophic damage was done and the porch, the living room, and the roof were gone, I had seen enough. The point had been made, not just to them, but to myself. The spell was broken. I turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving my parents standing on the sidewalk amidst the dust and the noise, two shrunken, hollowed-out figures watching their greed get turned into a landfill. They didn't say another word to me. There was nothing left to say. Their lawyers guided them back to their car, and they drove away from the wreckage, both literally and figuratively. That was the last time I ever saw them in person. The fallout for them was as swift and total as the demolition itself. The developer's lawsuit was a legal tsunami. They were sued not only for the full purchase price of the house, but for breach of contract, fraud, and punitive damages. My parents, who had always seen themselves as clever operators, were utterly outmatched by a corporate legal team that viewed them as little more than a bug to be squashed. The legal battle drained every penny they had. The fraudulent sale money was clawed back instantly, then went their savings, then went their own home, the one they'd lived in for 30 years. A lifetime of accumulated assets was washed away in a matter of months, all to pay back the debt they had incurred in a single greedy afternoon. The last I heard from a distant relative was that they had moved into a small, rented apartment on the other side of the state. Their reputation in the community was destroyed, and their dreams of a luxurious, carefree retirement had vanished. They had gambled my legacy and, in the end, had lost their own. I have not spoken to them since that day, and I feel no need to. Our family was not a casualty of the demolition. It was a pre-existing condition that the demolition simply exposed. For my part, I won't pretend I felt a sense of glee watching the house come down. It wasn't a celebration. It was a funeral. It was a painful, necessary amputation to save the soul of a place I loved. It hurt to destroy the physical structure that held so many of my most cherished memories. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it was far more painful to let it stand as a monument to their betrayal. For weeks afterward, whenever I had a quiet moment, the phantom sound of splintering wood and shattering glass would echo in my mind. But as time went on, that sound began to fade, replaced by a different feeling: peace. The lot is empty now. The demolition crew cleared every last piece of debris, graded the earth, and sprinkled grass seed. It is now just a quiet, empty square of green under an open sky. When I returned home for good after my service was complete, I went and stood in the middle of it. There was no ghost of the old house, no lingering resentment. The land felt clean. It was a blank canvas, a clean slate, finally free of the toxic history and the grasping hands that had tried to claim it. My grandfather had given me the ground to stand on, and for the first time, it felt truly and completely mine. The moral of this story, if there is one, is simple. When you choose to disrespect a person's sacrifice, when you see a legacy of love and honor as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle between you and a pile of cash, you should be very, very careful. You might find that the foundation you built your entire greedy scheme upon belongs to someone else, and someday they might just decide to tear it all down. My plan now is to build again. Not a big house, just a small, simple home with a porch and a swing. A house built not just on solid ground, but on a foundation of honor. A place where I can finally, truly come home.